If you can't hear me, let me know. I will pass the torch to Mom at part of it, and then Dad will take over. So,
What button do I push?
press this button.
Oh, okay.
This one, right
Yeah,
there.
there.
All right.
Okay.
So the West family came from England, arriving to America in 1639. And Thomas, the first generation that later came to West Gwillimbury, ended up being a storekeeper in Ohio, and he bought goods on the half-credit system. And the depreciation of paper money caused his failure in 1818, and instead of time in prison, he essentially fled Ohio and landed in East Gwillimbury at a Quaker settlement. And he taught school here for 2 years. His family then moved from East Gwillimbury, we're doing great, East Gwillimbury to West Gwillimbury, arriving at Lot 2 on the Concession 5 in 1829. And he occupied the 200 acres between Concession 5 and 6 on Lot 2 between Highway 27 and 5 Side Road. 10 years later, in 1839, the patent for the 200 acres was granted by the Crown. 6 years after that, he moved to Wisconsin with his wife and son Quincy, where he died at the age of 61. And the farm was sold 3 years later for $2,000 in 1848. He also owned 100 acres on the north side of the 4th concession, also at Lot 2, for 2 years before he went to the States. Yep. He and his wife had 10 children, 5 of which owned land in West Gwillimbury, and eventually all except 3 moved back to the United States. The sections that you can see highlighted show the areas south of Bont Head that have been owned by members of the West family between 1829 and 1956. In 1956, the last farm owned was sold, and land further north for Pinkerton was bought by my grandfather, which my dad and mom still farm today. Eventually, 3 did stay in West Gwillimbury, but we are very fortunate. We have a relative in California who has done a ton of research. And on his ancestry page, a different relative had shared this letter that shows that the intent was not always to stay in West Gwillimbury, that they found it difficult and thought that life back in the States was maybe more prosperous. However, 3 did stay despite what the letter shared. So 2 of the sons that did go back to the States were Quincy and Thomas Jr., but they did own land before they left. Quincy, for a very short period of time in 1841, owned 100 acres on the south side of Concession 5, just south of his father's farm. And he went to Michigan, and his parents ended up living with him, as did one of his sisters. And the second brother that went back to the States was Thomas Jr. And he married Hannah Phillips, who was a Quaker. And from research, she was disowned by the church because Thomas was not part of the religion. As a couple with their kids, they went back to Wisconsin, where Thomas left Hannah and married the neighbor who he had an additional family with. We can assume this made for some interesting family ties because there was a double wedding between the Phillips and the West, so the other 2 siblings from each family remained married up here. So Thomas Jr. owned 3 properties before he went to the States. 3/4 of an acre in what became Bont Head, 50 acres on the 5th concession at Lot 4, and 100 acres on the 6th concession, Lot 3, which was just east of his father's farm. It's off of this property that years later, Thomas didn't sell it, but years later, the Christian church bought part of the northwest corner in 1856, and a church was built, and there was a cemetery there. In 1861, the census said that the church seated 300 people and was valued at $1,500. And the stones from the cemetery were moved in 1930s. We're not sure where the stones were moved. I'm assuming Bont Head, but we don't know that. I don't know if somebody up there knows that, but we weren't sure. So the next child of Thomas, the first that came to West Gwillimbury, was Eliza, who married William Phillips. So she was part of the double marriage. And the Phillips family is just south of Bont Head, and so north of the 6. So the Phillips family originally owned the 200 acres there, And when the father passed away, the South 100 went to William, who married West. And that stayed in the family until 1886 and had been in the Phillips family for 63 years and was later owned by the Stoddart family before it was sold, and the buildings are all gone now. Lloyd Leeson, who lived just north of Newton Robinson, is a descendant from this line. Thomas's other son Benjamin lived on the 6th, and he first owned the west half of Lot 4 between the 6th and 7th and expanded to the northeast section. He lived his whole life in West Gwillimbury, but is buried in Michigan, where he died while he was visiting one of his sons, David, who was a doctor. A second son, Alfred, was also a doctor and for a time lived in Pond Head before moving to the States. A third son, Benjamin, sold the 150 acres, Benjamin sold the 150 acres to a third son, Stephen, who farmed it with the fourth son, Wakefield, until it was sold in 1876. And then both of those boys moved to the States as well. The last of Thomas's children to stay in West Gwillimbury is George Washington. He was born in Ohio and was 7 when he came to Canada and is buried at Pond Head. And he bought the north side of the 6th concession at Lot 6, so just between 400 and 5 Side Road, just south of 88. So there's the little clover leaf at the 400 shown in the top right. His first wife died 5 days after their 5th child, George Thomas. My great-great-grandfather was born. She's buried at the Quaker Cemetery in Dunkerron. And his second marriage was to Mary Tate, and she is buried in Pond Head with him. And she had 3 nieces, the Tate girls, and the 3 sons. For George Washington buried those 3 nieces. So it would have been a small family gathering at Christmas. The next son, Solomon, so you can kind of follow along here where we are because there's a lot of generation. Son Solomon worked the home property at the 6th with his father and his brother, and he rented land before he took over that farm when his father passed away. And the farm was sold by his second wife in 1899, 1 year after he died at age 53. This property was in the family for 65 years at the time that it was sold. And his great-granddaughter, Karen Kolb, who Dad and Mom still have contact with today, was able to share the sale flyers that she found in her family archives. So Benjamin, Solomon's brother, farmed as well with his father and brother, and he ended up buying on the south side of Concession 5 at Lot 6, so just south of his father's farm. And this farm was sold in 1895 when he moved to York, and he's buried at Newmarket Cemetery with 2 of their 7 children. One of his sons, Charles, was the only child that stayed in West Gwillimbury. Thank you. He owned land on the north and south sides of Concession 5 at Lot 2 for 44 years. This property was later owned by Bruce Keffer and is where Robert and Jean are currently. And the 75 acres on the north side was part of the original Thomas West 200 acres. George Thomas was the youngest of George's sons, and before owning land, he worked the farm on the south side of Concession 6, south of his father's, and he ended up buying the farm to the west, where his father was, of property that his father owned, but doesn't appear like he actually worked, but that both of his brothers worked it before he took it over. The photo is one that we have from Grandpa. That is the house pre-1908, and shows George and his son Moses. The house and barn there, the house was built in 1908, the year that George Thomas's bride, Nancy Tate, passed away, leaving him widowed with 4 children. Margaret Jane is one of them, who died at age 12 and is buried in Pond Head. Laura married Norman Houghton, they moved to Alberta. And then BC, Fred was a teacher and accountant and is buried in Toronto, and Moses He was part of a double marriage as well, married Lorena Houghton, who went by Laura Houghton. It's confusing because it makes two Laura Houghtons in the family, but they were children of Alfred and Ellen Houghton, who were buried in the cemetery here. Moses, whose dad's grandfather took over the 100-acre farm after his father's death in 1913, and he expanded the property and by buying the 50 acres to the east 10 years later. This property sold in 1956, 1 year after Moses died. This farm is the longest property held in the West name and was owned by 3 generations for 92 years. Moses attended number 3 school, which was just east and off the property of the farm he lived on his whole life. He was a trustee and secretary of the school for many years, and we were able to find through Governor's Left Here archives that when the school burned, the West Home was used as the schoolhouse for 4 months. Before the church union in 1925, he was a member of the Presbyterian Church at Font Head, and then later a member and elder of the United Church there.
Okay, we're going to swap. It's okay, you can hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, this is a picture that we found. I think this is amazing. I think a number of you people will know of thrashing bees. Well, this is actually a manure bee. These tractors and people, I'm not sure if this is at my grandpa's place or where it's at, but it just shows how the community came together when there was a need and there was a purpose. This goes back 1949. So for some of you, I think tractors were just nicely getting going in the late 40s. And just the idea of having neighbors come together at a time of need. And we put the names up there. We actually found the names that are associated with this. There's Bob Stafford, who is my uncle, Harold West, my dad, Bill Culbert, George Beatty, and I'm sure a lot of you will understand and hear and recognize the surname, Walter Meir, Stanley Brown, Bob Westlick, who was a neighbor, Moses West, who was my grandpa, Gordon Jeffrey, Mel Stewart, Whit Jessup, Jack Gray, and Earl Jessup. And so a lot of those people just lived in the area, but I just thought it's just neat to put that picture in because it just shows some of the history and the camaraderie that is in a rural farm neighborhood. This is a picture of Laura and Moses and their 4 children. In the back row you can see there's my parents, Harold and Marion, and I better follow the notes here. No. Okay, there's 4 children. There was twins born in Toronto General Hospital in 1915. I think that's kind of unique. Why all of a sudden you would end up traveling that far, or the circumstances, I'm not sure. Helen, one of the twins, died at the age of 14 of influenza, and she's buried in Bond Head. And I think from everybody so far, we can certainly understand that there was an awful lot of infant mortality or youth mortality in the area. And you think of families having 10 children, it's almost like there would be 10 children with the hoping that there'd be 5 that would survive into adulthood. Herb farmed with his father. He was part of the twin. And he was a truck driver after moving to Barrie with his mother after the farm was sold. The daughter, Evelyn, married Bob Stafford, and they're buried in the Bond Head Cemetery. And they farm actually just west of Newton Robinson. When you go up to the hill, down on the flats on the left-hand side. Aunt Evelyn made the best dang gravy you could ever hope for. Oh, it's amazing how you remember people. Okay, the youngest son was my dad, Harold, and he lived from 1919 to 2001. And he met his wife, Marion English, when she boarded at the West, and she was teaching at SS number 3. That's at the corner of the 6th line and 5 side. And they were married for 59 years, and they attended the United Church here in Newton Robinson. And Mom was actually the organist for a good number of years at the church here, and they're both buried in the cemetery just across the road. Now, Mom and Dad rented for 5 years. land, and they purchased property up on the 11th line of Bradford West Willenbury, just one line north of Newton Robinson, in between 27th and the 5th side road. And they bought this first property from the Terrys, go back one, sorry, Keener, in 1947. We showed this picture to Kimberly, and she said, I have no idea where that property is. So this is looking from, let's say, the barn north. You never had to worry about, in those days, cutting grass. There would always be animals or something that would take up the space. And I can remember Mom saying the first thing she wanted to do was plant some trees because there was nothing there. Well, she planted poplars and Manitoba maples. Cursed short-term trees. The windmill there, the windmill is down, but we still use the old existing well.
Wow. Nice.
So things do last for a long period of time, and actually the structure of that house is very similar to this day. Okay. They had 3 children, all boys, great trio. Ken, Alan, and myself, Lloyd. And there's also a picture of us with Mom and Dad, and that was in 1991, so the information says, right? Okay, and since that time, yeah, we had some, not accidents in our family, but circumstances where both of my brothers, Ken and Alan, are deceased. Ken died in 2001 at the age of 57, and my brother Alan died in 2009 at the age of 62. So either I'm on borrowed time now, or else I'm going to live to be about 140 years old. I don't know. Pick and think about what's going on. School for us was at Pinkerton, SS number 11. And it was interesting, we used to walk down there, and Ken actually, when he went to high school, got the high school bus on the overpass on the 11th line at 400 Highway. So could you ever imagine a school bus stopping on 400 Highway to pick up students? So it's just, again, how time has changed. This has really nothing to do with the West. Well, yeah, we're in it, but I think this is important. This is a picture of the people who attended the church next door in 1966.
Nice.
And we actually have the names
That's nice.
of all the people who were there.
Oh, wow.
And I want you to think about that quilt. That quilt to me is extremely important at the back, because the majority of the families that went to that church at that period of time are represented on that quilt.
Nice.
So if you think, again, I'm living in the house that I was born in. This is where we had, this hall is where we had our Christmas concerts from Pinkerton Church. And you think of the Newton Robinson Church that you attended all your life. The names on that quilt mean maybe more to me than it does to a lot of you. But it's just an indication of the history that is here. And I gotta admit, if you know of an Anglican or a Catholic or Presbyterian church that can get a youth out like that nowadays, I take my hat off to you, because it certainly isn't the way that the majority of those churches are going. Dad ended up, this is a picture of the home farm that Dad bought, and this picture is taken in 1952. And it just gives you the idea, at that point in time, pretty well all farms were 100 acres and of a mixed farming nature. You had some chickens, and just in front of, I call it the red shed. I've always called it the red shed. Bonnie says there's no red on it. And it's actually falling down, but the wind won't catch it to take it down. That was a colony house. Then over on the left you had the pig pen. You had the old stack, hay stack or straw stack there, and even in the front there was some orchard trees. So it was just, this is a typical 100-acre farm, and you more than likely had about 8 fields, because you didn't want to tackle any more than 12 acres of hay in a day to try and get it done. Okay, you're about 1970. This is when Alan was at home farming with Dad, and Ken came home, and we expanded the dairy farm, or the dairy barn, with the bull barn on the south. We were running cattle in on shifts, and we ended up putting stabling in the bull barn, and it virtually doubled the size of the dairy herd at that point in time.
How many would you milk?
We were milking close to 50 at that point in time. Yeah. And this is, I guess you'd say, our pride and joy. For Bonnie and I, this is in 2017. Wow, we look good there. This is our 40th wedding anniversary. And there's Stephen, our oldest son, who's married in London. Kimberly, who's here, and Carolyn, who is married, and she's up in the Midland area, and she's actually married to a full-fledged farmer up there. John's in-laws are farmers, and Stephen's in-laws, some of you who are in the livestock business might know of a gentleman by the name of veterinarian called Ken Leslie. Yeah. Robert, do you know Ken? Yeah. Okay, well, Stephen is married to Ken's daughter. So actually even on Ken, or on Stephen's side, there's actually farming background. So we've been very fortunate for everybody that the wives haven't said supper is between 6 o'clock and 10 after 6. If you're here at a quarter after, the dog gets it. So they've had good grounding on that. One more? Okay. And this is a picture of the farm taken in 2012. Because of the passing of my brothers, our dairy herd was liquidated in 2001. That was a pretty tough year for us. Bonnie's mom died the first week of August, my brother Ken died the last week of August, and Dad died Remembrance Day. So, and we had just liquidated the dairy herd the April before that, and that was at the time just before there was some disease import restrictions from UK, and at that point in time we had the 4th highest herd dispersal in Canada. So since then, we have, Bonnie and I are farming now by ourselves, and the land that was used for feeding the livestock is no longer needed for that purpose. So the silo has come down. We thought better remove that before all of a sudden it came down on its own, and we've changed and put up some different grain bins to store our products. And the last generation around is 7th and 8th generation. Kim and John and their 3 boys live actually in the house on the Horner property at the corner of the 10th line and 5 Sidewalk, and I think a lot of you will remember that when Alan Horner had his auctions there. So I think that pretty well covers us. Anything else? Any questions for Bonnie?
I just have a comment that it's impressive to how many aerial photographs you have of your farm. Because I remember occasionally my parents getting a photo, but they were expensive, and the salespeople used to come around, and you've got several, so obviously that was very important. And now it's a drone, but back then it was a real photo.
It is important because I don't know how your memory is, but mine isn't getting any better. And Kimberly, the other, I guess it'd be about 2 weeks ago, she said, I'm not exactly sure where Aunt Evelyn lived. So we went for a drive. And I could show her where Aunt Evelyn lived, and then where they moved into town, and where Mom's father, my mother's name was English. So her mom and dad, her mom and dad moved into Alliston. And I remember their house backed right up against the railroad track, and as a little kid that was just huge entertainment seeing the train go by. So we were going around the area, and we could go a certain distance, and I could say who farmed on both sides of the road. Past the next crossroad, I hadn't a clue. And you go about 2 miles north of where we are, I don't know who farmed there. And it's just, we came to Newton Robinson, it was a general store. And I can remember when tax came in, and whoever was checking you out, they had a tobacco container there with a slot in it, and they put a penny in that, and that tin represented the tax collection. There also was a post office in the general store. We didn't travel that much further than 2 or 3, 4 miles from home. Bob Wood can talk about families down his neck of the woods, which is only an 88 highway. And I have to say, I've heard of them, but I don't know them. So it's interesting, the circuit that you worked in, and again, just that circuit of the United Church was only more than likely no greater than 6 miles. Like, let's say 3 miles east and west of 27 Highway, and maybe you went from the 9th up to the 11th. And it's just interesting, but you're right. Having pictures and documentation, and honest to Pete, for some of the older people here, I remember when Dad passed away, Mom was pretty distraught. She would be going through photo albums and saying, well, you know, I remember this, and we said, please, take the photo out. On the back, try and put on who's in that photo, what house it is, and even if you can tell what decade it might have been.
And she did. It was very helpful.
Yeah. Time's up. Okay, sorry.